so many people here. Yay. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It's so great to see all of you here in person. And I'm sorry I'm out of breath because I just ran down to my office and back. And we're also welcoming those who are also watching from home. There's over 40 people already coming from home too, so it's a full house tonight. Our surveys have shown that people really like very local history topics, and I think this kind of proves that, right? So for those of you who don't know, my name is Erin Quinn Velcho, and I am the museum curator for the Lacey Museum. Our speaker tonight is Megan Ockerman, who will be sharing her vast knowledge of the Olympia Brewing Company. But before we dive in, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Lacey Museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically Southern Lushootseed speakers, Nisqually, and Squaxin Island tribes. We acknowledge and remember not to forget those tribal people that are named, but not recognized today and absorbed into other tribes for survival, or were relocated. We recognize the ancestors and their relations that are still here. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as part of the City of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in government-to-government partnership. All right, so now on to some museum updates. We would love to see everyone at the museum. We are open Thursdays and Fridays 11 to 3, and Saturdays 10 to 4. Coming very soon, we will be hosting a Smithsonian poster exhibit called Journey Stories. We finally have our staffing back up to where it should be. And so we will be able to do that changeover. This exhibit explores how movement has shaped our nation with a look at American expansion and migration from the earliest settlers and Native American displacement to the effects of transportation on modern mobility. But our tours will also include some great ties to local stories, so I definitely encourage you to check it out and learn a little bit more about the community that we had of the past. Coming up next month, we hope that you will join us for our February History Talk with Dr. Jewel Lawrence Dunn, who is a researcher at the Washington State Archives. Dr. Dunn is an incredible font of knowledge about research, in particular genealogical records. I learn something new from her every single time I talk to her, I think. And she will be sharing her insights on accessing and using the amazing collections at the State Archives. But probably our biggest piece of news is that we have hired a full-time museum coordinator. Many of you will likely recognize Felicia Rova Cameron from her previous stint as part-time educator with us, and we are so very delighted to have her on full-time. She is having some trial by fire. Today is her first day. Welcome, Felicia. As such, I'm not making her talk today. She's just going to wave and smile. But she'll be the one up here next month, rest assured. Thank you. So now for tonight, we will hold our question and answer section at the end, just like usual. And hopefully it'll be a lot easier this time because I have help. We'll take questions both from our online audience and from our in-person audience. Our in-person audience, we have a microphone that will pass around because otherwise no one at home will know what you said. So Felicia will be passing the microphone around afterwards, and I'll be fielding the online questions. So I think it will work out just fine. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Megan is a historian, an author, and a third-generation Olympian. Her master's thesis is on the Olympia Brewing Company, and her most recent article, published in Columbia Magazine, explains the role women played at the brewery. She is the assistant director of the Olympia Tumwater Foundation and enjoys her office view looking over the Deschutes at the brewery. Who couldn't like that at the brewery park at Tumwater Falls? And she spends her spare time walking and doing yoga, exploring South Puget Sound, baking, reading, and cramming as much history into each day as humanly possible, all things I can get behind. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Of course, thank you. It's a full-time job. Hey. Hi, thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay, it does. Okay, great. I think we'll wait till my PowerPoint starts, but I haven't given this talk since before COVID, so pray for me. But I do like to ask how many people here either worked for or had a family member, friend, teacher who worked at the brewery during summers. Okay, I was expecting a little bit more, but that is great. So this talk is actually going to be, and I will have to assume that the people on Zoom also fill out that. There's got to be some of them in the audience too. But this
Megan,
talk
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to get closer to your mic.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I will try not to spit or shout. This talk is going to be a little bit top-heavy on the earlier years of the brewery because just less people know about those early years, and none of us here were there to witness them. So I do like to focus a little bit more on the 1890s, say, to the 1940s or so. A lot of us, I think, are a lot more familiar with, well, I'm not quite as old, but what we can remember from the later part of the 20th century. So that is why we'll be focusing on those earlier years, but we will definitely cover the fun parts at the end too. So let's get started. Our story starts in January of 1846 in a small town about an hour northwest of Frankfurt called Dornassenheim, where Leopold Schmidt was born. And I did the math yesterday, and on the 23rd of January, his birthday would be 177 years old, which, I'm pretty well steeped in Leopold's life, so it just seems so crazy to me that he's, closer to 200 than he's closer to any of our ages. But Leopold is the young man in the back leaning on the chair here. He was the oldest son and had 7 brothers and sisters, pictured here with a brother-in-law as well. And we know very little about his early childhood other than his dad, Wilhelm, who's also pictured here, was a mining engineer in Germany and was politically active enough that during 1848, when many uprisings were occurring all over Europe, he fled to the United States to Missouri, where there were a lot of Germans. When Leopold was a child, he was gone for a couple of years, and it's likely that he would have been fleeing prison time, or else he probably wouldn't have left. His time in Missouri will come up again just in a few minutes when Leopold is a young man. But what we do know is that Leopold was extremely curious and able. And it's not my intention. I really don't want to make this, the Leopold worship hour. But what becomes obvious is he's really He's good at what he does. Whatever he sets his mind to, he really invests his time in. He's curious, and he's successful at pretty much everything he does. It's really rather impressive, right? Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about him nearing his 177th birthday. And so the first example of this is in 1860, when he's only 14 years old. He decides to become a seaman, and he enrolls in a seaman school in Hamburg. After he graduated, he worked for the Hamburg America line, and he sailed all over the world, mostly on ships delivering supplies. It's during this time as a sailor that he first comes to the U.S. So it's 1866, and he's sailing around Hudson's Bay and the Great Lakes. And he decides in the fall, when shipping is slowing down because rivers get icy, that he was going to stay in America throughout the winter to practice his English. And in doing so, he decided that he would go down to Missouri. Now, we don't actually know who the people who his dad fled with, whether they were extended family, whether they were family friends, whoever they were, but they stayed in Missouri when his dad went back to Germany. So Leopold goes down to Missouri, and he stays with these people. And he liked it so much that when it came time to go back to his ship, he decided not to. He decided to stay in Missouri. Instead, he starts his new life as a carpenter. And over the next 5 years, this is what he does. He starts learning and honing his skills. And then 5 or so years later, again, it seems on a whim, he decides that he's going to go up to Montana and go join what's going on in the gold rush. So he and 2 other men, they go up the Missouri River in a, one would assume, a steamship and a riverboat and all those fun things. And then they walked the remaining 150 miles to Helena, likely along a route called the Mullen Road, which was a military wagon road. And now he becomes one of the founders and the earliest settlers of Butte, and probably rebuilt some of the buildings after a large fire destroyed the downtown just a year or so earlier. So there's really only, a few hundred people there. It's about 1871. So gold at the time was still being mined, but it was really on the dip, and it's before copper was discovered there. So it's before Butte takes off. And it's in Butte that we finally get to his last vocation as a brewer. Now, in Butte, Leopold earned a reputation as a hard worker and a reliable person. Now, in the 19th century, nearly every town had its own brewery, of course, if not multiple, and Butte was no different. Like I said, at this time, it wasn't as huge as it becomes when copper is discovered. So they only have one brewery. And the man who owned Butte's local brewery was a man named Pierre, or Peter Valentin. And he wanted to go on an extended trip to regain his health. For a long time, the lore of the brewery was he went back to France. He was French, his name's Pierre, to regain his health. But actually some more recent letters that our curator has found, it seems that he maybe just stayed in the States, right? At this time, Montana's not a state. So he actually has letters that say he's going to go to the States. So who knows where he went, but he went on an extended trip. And in his absence, he asked Leopold to run his business, despite the fact that Leopold had no experience brewing beer. So again, I can only imagine they know each other because it's a small town. They're both working in this mining town. Maybe it's because Leopold's got this good reputation. Who really knows? But he runs his brewery for a year while he's gone. And when Valentin returned, he sold his brewery to 2 miners who just immediately failed. They failed at the business. But during this year, Leopold decided he liked this, and he decided that he would go into brewing. And in 1876, he and another man who happened to be Valentin's former business partner, they opened their own brewery named Centennial Brewery, which, of course, is named after the country's centennial. And at the start, Leopold is still making door and window sashes to make ends meet, but quickly this becomes the largest brewery in Montana. And while I don't want to take anything away from him because that's still impressive, like Montana at this time doesn't have a lot of people and it doesn't have a lot of breweries, but big brewery, big deal. And then a couple years later, in 1878, he decides to go to Germany to attend a brewer school. And this is like a perfect time. Besides like what I said, he's very interested in learning the science and the skills behind what he does. He obviously has the on-the-job experience, but now he really wants to know everything that's going on. And at this time, this is when Louis Pasteur he's writing about yeast, and people are really starting to learn about hygiene and how that relates to, beer and how you can have consistency in batches without it spoiling. So he's really on the cutting edge of all this science and learning about this at a really important time. And at the same time, while he's in Germany, he met and married his wife, Joanna, and brought this cosmopolitan-esque, she wasn't from a big town, but she helped run an inn and she could speak multiple languages and she was well educated. He brought her back to Butte, Montana. So bless her, that was probably a culture shock. I've also read things that say, she was the nurse of the town and had all these skills. And I don't know if that's really true. She probably knew more than a lot of people, but I don't know that she was actually seen as a town doctor or anything like that. But just 11 months after getting married and coming back, they have their first child in 1880, Peter G. Schmidt, who we will, of course, be talking about later. And so for the next 20 years, Leopold runs Centennial, and he involves himself in the local community. He moves his growing family to Deer Lodge for better schools, and what I can only assume is for, less ill repute, as Butte is becoming this huge, rowdy town. And he is a county commissioner. He's on the commission to make Montana a state, and then when that happens, he's eventually a state legislator. And he was also on their state's capital commission, which brought him out to Washington in the summer of 1895. So this image is what the old brewery property looked like when Leopold came here on a visit. When he was on this Capitol Commission, they were going around Western states to look at Capitol buildings and get an idea of what they wanted in Helena. So that's why he was in Olympia. And how he came about discovering this property and the artesian springs, the artesian well water that we all know so well, how those springs were on this property is really not so much up for debate as it is something that we'll just likely never know. There are at least 3 iterations of a story about how he found it, about who told him these springs were there, what they told him about this water, who the realtor was, who sold it to him. I don't really have the time to get into the details of all of those. I think they are, at the end of the day, I think they're all sort of mishmashed in together into a nice, beautiful origin story for the brewery that I don't think has a ton of credence to it. And I say that because if I'm going to stereotype, Leopold and Peter were pretty German in their record keeping. They wrote down a lot. And they recorded a lot in letters, and there's really nothing to back up these stories. So at least the realtor part is true. And he did end up buying this property in September of 1895. So, it didn't take him a lot of time. He did, however he found out about it, he went down to this property, he tried this water and was like, wow, I need this place. So when he purchased the land, which, I'll actually just go back a second. It had 5 acres, 2 houses, 30 horsepower of water, and an orchard. If I'm not mistaken, he bought it for $4,500 in 1895, which is, but he thought it was a good deal. Since I heard you just say that. A lot of money. He thought it was a good deal. He wrote that in a letter. But his intent was to build a small brewery as a side project, and his brother Louis, who was going to manage it day to day. And maybe by now, maybe not, it should be obvious, but Leopold was not the kind of dude who was going to sit by on the sidelines while somebody else was running this. And this quickly became his baby project. And Louis, his brother, who didn't have such a large family, by this time, Leopold had 6 kids. So, they needed a house of 8. His brother lived on the small house that was on the property, but Leopold didn't quite move up here yet. But he was gonna let Louis run it day to day. But this was his baby project. And in November, so this is 2 months after buying the property, you can't see it on this letter, but the date is November. And it was in November. So some of the tannery buildings that you just saw on the last slide, they were already torn down. But he sent 2 samples of artesian water to a brewing lab in Chicago, and I transcribed part of it so you don't have to look at the cursive. But he wanted it tested to see how well it would do for brewing. So he bought this land and then decided to test the water. And it was, quote, perfect for brewing water. So after he gets that, he divested all of his interest in Montana and focused on brewing or building this new business in Tumwater. And just to put that into context, right, this is 1895. So he's just about 50 after owning the largest brewery in Montana for 20 years. He really doesn't need to start over. But we also think too, he moved out here because he wanted to be near the water. He liked sailing, wanted something different. Some family history says, he sort of wanted a summer place, which is kind of why he was out here in the first place, looking for land, which is not really true because he was out here for work. But regardless, he wanted to be near the water. He got to be near the water. And as it happens, he also got to build himself a new brewery, which is lucky for us. So by the next year, 1896, everything was ready for the Capitol Brewing Company to open. And in October, the first beer was sold to rave reviews. And it was so well received at the time, the going rate for a barrel of beer was $3.25. But Leopold sold his at $8 per barrel. And he sold 3,500 in 3 months. So I have a fancy pointer, so I will tell you what's going on here. So the original brew house was painted bright red. Here's one of the houses, they used it as an office. Here's the other house that Lewis lived in. The family referred to it as the Hillside Inn. And here's the orchard. And then over here you can see the Lower Falls and the original iconic bridge. The one at Brewery Park is a replica because that would be dangerous. But here is the original Olympia Brewery. Now, what's going to become clear throughout the rest of this little chat we're having is that throughout the life of the brewery in this area, it was constantly expanding. And that had a lot to do, of course, with the quality of the beer. You know, if you have bad beer, you're probably not going to be selling a lot. And Leopold was religious in his views of how clean he wanted his breweries to be. And that is true. I know if there was anybody who worked there, that was true until the day it closed in 2003. Everything was scrubbed regularly and cleaned with artesian water. And as you can see, the motto was quality first, quantity next. And as people got hold of this lager, they wanted more. So over the next few years, the brewery down there on the tidal flats blossomed to nearly a dozen structures and was being shipped all over the Pacific. And to give a little more context, maybe I will go back again. This land, as you can see, where the old brew house is today, has more land. There's more infill and siltation. So at the time, right, it's 5 acres, and at its height, it had about a dozen buildings that were going 24/7. So it was really jam-packed, just like a buzzing beehive down there. Yeah, there was a brew house and cellars, a machine shop, carpenter shop, boilers, keg houses, keg lining, all that. And that's going 24/7, and they're shipping it everywhere. And fortunately for him, at the same time, he's really starting to get hitting the ground running, the Klondike Gold Rush started, and he jumped on that. So by 1898, he's shipping beer to Alaska, China, Russia, Hawaii, and even the Philippines after Admiral Dewey defeated the Spanish at Manila Bay in the Spanish-American War because Dewey's flagship was named the USS Olympia. With Capitol growing and international customers becoming familiar with the beer, a couple things happened in 1902. One was the name changed from Capitol to the Olympia Brewing Company. And according to Peter, and this comes from a 1946 speech celebrating the 50th anniversary, he said that, although locals referred to the beer as Tumwater beer, most of the mail came as Olympia Brewery. And then according to Leopold, from the time, he said that the name change made sense just because of the geographical connection. And I won't get into the weeds, but I know in 1905 or so, there was a copyright issue, and legally, I believe you can have a copyrighted name, a geographical location, but you can't have a product named after one. So the Olympia Brewing Company is named after the city of Olympia, and that's fine. You can have Olympia Supply, Olympia whatever. That's fine. Olympia Beer is actually copyrighted off another trademark that they bought. So it is not named after the city. It's named after the USS Olympia. Indirectly, because it actually comes from a different, like a grocery store or something. I can't remember, but it's convoluted. But they went to great lengths to make sure that they could keep those, which again, good on them. Then also in 1902, they adopted the slogan, "It's the water," and the person responsible for that is this man. This man is Frank Kenny, and in 1901, he became the bookkeeper for the brewery. So he really hadn't been there for all that long when in 1902 he went to Leopold and suggested to him that they have a slogan. And he said it needed to be short. and he suggested it's the water. And Leopold said, "That's a great idea. Let's do the water makes it." And he said, "No, that's not what I said. It needs to be short. Let's keep it as it's the water." And Leopold was like, "Excellent. Let's say it's in the water." And he said, no. Like, it needs to be short. It needs to rouse curiosity. And we are known for our brewing water. Like, that's what everybody knows. It's the water. Come on, man. And so Leopold told him to sleep on it. They would take it up the next day. So according to Frank Kenny, they go back and forth the whole day. And Leopold finally caves. And he also writes this story about, 50 years after it happens, or says it and somebody transcribes it. But he says that, Leopold was the kind of person who would try to poke holes in somebody's argument to see if there were flaws. So that's possibly what was going on here. He also said, and maybe this is an embellishment, but said that, when he suggested this slogan, he saw a twinkle and a smidge of a smirk that immediately vanished. So he thinks, maybe he liked it from the start. And he just wanted to see him stick to his guns. But that he did, and lucky for him, unlucky for somebody else, the secretary died in 1902, and Leopold promoted Frank Kenny to secretary, which he stayed until the 1950s or so when he did retire. So arguing with Leopold for 2 days, ended up working out pretty well for him. Now, new name, new slogan in hand. The orders, they just keep pouring in, and that's a pun intended. The brewery outgrows its buildings, and in 1905, the property starts to resemble the brewery that we are used to seeing. The brick brew house was completed in 1906, and more cellars and other outbuildings are added. And for the next 8 years, the story of just expansion and terrific sales is much the same until 1914. 1914 is when Leopold died. He died at a hotel named for him in Bellingham, and his oldest son, Peter, takes over. It's in the same year, Leopold died in September, and just a couple months later in November, voters in Washington pass statewide prohibition, as do voters in Oregon and in Idaho, although in Idaho it wasn't across the board. It was slightly different. But basically, the brewery's main area shuts down. I don't want to get too much into it, but in this photo, so here's the original brewery that's been repainted. This has got to be, it's probably 1906. This half of the cellar, which is still on the grounds, was done in 1904, but there's another half of the aging cellar that was finished in 1907. And doesn't look like this is up and running yet, so this is probably 1906. And this is the Schmidt House, which is finished in 1904. And here's the Hillside Inn. So I won't be going into Prohibition because that's not as fun. But suffice to say that somebody could write a book on what the Schmidts did during Prohibition. They, like a lot of brewing families, they did just fine. I will say that, like many brewers across the country, they repurposed the machinery for a time. So they owned creameries, they made ice cream, they had butter, they had an ice factory, and they made fruit juices. So they started in Salem, because actually the Schmidts owned 5 breweries, and a lot of them had the exact same recipe for Olympia beer, but they couldn't call it Olympia beer because they didn't have the right water. And so it was just slightly different. They didn't have artesian water, so they didn't want to call it Olympia beer. But one of those breweries was in Salem. And so in Salem, they started making a loganberry juice that they called Loju. And up here, they started making an apple juice called Apple Jew that they would also carbonate. So it was kind of a fancy champagne, if you will. And so that only lasted until the early 1920s before that went defunct. And that was the last time that the old brewery, as we know it, made beverages of any kind. The whole complex down there was purchased for a paper mill. And I guess luckily for the people in the area, it took them a while to actually get everything up and running. So if you're familiar with what buildings are down there now, there's a long building near the brew house, and that was built by the paper mill. And there's one or two others that were also built in the 20s. And they didn't actually start operating until about 1927 or 1928. So the people living nearby didn't have to suffer through the smell of a paper mill for very long, because the stock market crash of 1929 pretty much immediately shut it down. So, unfortunate for the people of Tumwater, but it was short-lived. But to get back to the brewery, Peter was convinced that eventually Prohibition would end. So he kept the trademarks active on the company and the slogan throughout the whole nearly 20 years from, Washington. Prohibition started January 1st, 1916, and so they don't start selling beer again until 1934. So it's nearly 20 years that he's keeping these active. And he didn't waste any time getting back into brewing when it was obvious that he could. He had decided, and this wasn't on his own, he had four brothers doing this with him. But Peter, as the president, decided that the old brewery was not going to be in good enough shape or large enough when Prohibition was repealed. So he and his brothers, but principally Adolf, which is the second oldest brother, determined they needed to build a new one, and they chose the location just up the river where it is today. And in 1933, they offered $1 public shares in the daily newspaper to help open a new complex. And they also had a large investment by Emil Sick, who he owned Seattle Malting and Brewing, who made Rainier. Kind of. That's another very complicated story for another day. But Emil Sick was the man who owned Rainier. And they quickly raised enough funds with that investment to build a new complex. And so by January 1934, the first batches of Olympia were released, just mere months after Prohibition was repealed by Congress. So here, Peter is on the left. His brother Adolf is the middle guy in the middle photo. And the kettle that you see here is the original, or like the first one in the new brewery. And the top of this is what is on display at Tumwater City Hall. Now, the second half, we have reached the second half. The second half of Olympia's story is what we are probably more familiar with. And so I'll be going over it a little bit more quickly, or else we could, talk about Olympia in movies, forever. But the overarching story is that, after Prohibition, sales they went like this. They just increased for decades. But like other breweries, Olympia, they did face hardships over the years and had, global events that they had to contend with, and other pressures that they had to adapt to. And the first one of those was the beer can. And this is an interesting thing because Peter was an inventor, an engineer. He was very technologically savvy. He would have been a techie by today's standards. He fiddled with everything, but he did not want to can beer right away when it was becoming a thing. It was first canned in 1935 on the East Coast, but the technology itself wasn't great. Beer could be put in a can that finally could be pasteurized without it exploding. But the metal leached through and you could taste it. It would sour the beer, ruin it, discolor it. And he didn't think that was good enough. So instead, they designed the stubby bottle in late 1935. And it was a wise move, because even though the brewery started canning beer eventually, they didn't have to deal as severely with metal shortages that came during World War II. And, it's a stubby. It's famous. You can still buy stubbies. Sometimes they're called steinies. But this baby is our invention. It wasn't the first time that Olympia was the first brewery to do something. We were the first brewery to have metal bottle caps instead of porcelain metal caps in the 1890s. But this is solely an Olympia invention. So the next big curveball is World War II, right? But because they weren't canning beer, this wasn't like a huge issue as far as what to do about packaging. But there was still a metal shortage, and the Schmidt family did spearhead a scrap recycling campaign throughout the county. They used their warehouse area to store huge containers of scrap metal, and they would use their delivery truck drivers to pick up scrap metal from people. I think they won some awards from the governor for doing that. But you can see here, women are re-crimping, well, they're sorting bottle caps to re-crimp. Adolf and Adolf Jr. actually designed a system where you could use metal, send it out to have the tin plate removed, and then cut it out and crimp it into like recycled bottle caps. And they would put cork on it so it would seal. But I think they also probably won an award for that. They're getting really creative. I don't have the time, of course, to like go over specifically women working at the brewery. But I will just say as a side note that, as far as we know, like World War II is the first time that women could work in the plant. I think that there were about 10 women working in the office and about 10 that worked in the plant. And most of them, either their sons or brothers worked at the brewery, but they were working as sorters doing this. And then at the end of the war, the Bottlers Union disallowed them. So from 1945 until roughly 1974, women could only have positions inside the office as, administrative roles. But I digress. During World War II, all breweries were required to send 15% of their product overseas to soldiers. So that took a pretty big toll on smaller breweries, right? So they have to send 15%, and then with the rest, they're trying to market it, and their target market is overseas anyway. So it's hard to sell. So it's taking a toll on smaller breweries. And, after Prohibition, it's not like the numbers of breweries has bounced back. There aren't really that many breweries anyway. That being said, though, Olympia still managed to come out of the war in the black. They were not losing money. After World War II and Korea, it was basically smooth sailing as far as production goes. But, in the decades following Prohibition, there were still a lot of dries who wanted wholesale bans on alcohol, but the brewing industry was a lot more prepared this time, and they were not going to let that happen again. And the brewery was no different. They were always ready to push back against a temperance movement. And as you can see in this picture, which I love, it is one of my favorites, one of the mottos of the company was that Olympia was a beer of temperate enjoyment. And people usually get a kick out of that when they see it. We had an art show at the Schmidt House in 2017 that had original artwork for billboards. And a lot of their advertising from the 30s says a light beer for temperate enjoyment. And people, like all the way back to Leopold, a lot of brewers, especially from the 19th century, they believed firmly in drinking responsibly and enjoying beer, but not going overboard, right? This is German culture. This is just like part of the lifestyle. They're not binge drinking, and it's not really heavy alcohol. After Prohibition, beer could only be 3% alcohol. And because of World War II, all of these brewers are sending out all of this pretty light beer. When these soldiers come back, that's what they're used to. That's what they like. So that's what they want. And that's what Olympia's been making for decades. So that's perfect. So well before Miller introduces light, L-I-T-E beer, Olympia called itself a light beer, L-I-G-H-T. And it wasn't, for the lack of calories or color or taste, but because it was refreshing and balanced with a moderate diet. It was easy on the digestion. So in the 1950s and 60s, that's really the beginning of Olympia's heyday as far as becoming more of like a national name. And the biggest problem the brewery faced during this time was that it needed to constantly expand to keep up with demand. They grew so fast that they couldn't wait for stainless steel tanks to be built, and so they had to make these wooden ones that you see here. I believe that they were made out of teak. and they started moving southward into Tumwater Valley and eventually rerouted the river to be able to use some of that land. So here, let's see, you can see where the river was rerouted, which is probably why it's so difficult for anybody to do anything with these warehouses right here, because they're in a floodplain. You can see where the hatchery facility is at Brewery Park right now. You can see here is like the original, so the fish ladder. Most of these buildings are still here. This one is gone, and these are gone. And some of these are, damaged and worse for wear, but this is pretty much what we're used to seeing. But, so growth, it's not usually too much of a burden on business. And by the 1970s, Olympia is starting to compete with some of the largest breweries in the country. But what is important to understand is in the 1970s, the beer industry is rapidly consolidating. So again, I don't have time to really go into why, besides that, if anybody has questions, I'll get into it. But larger breweries after World War II, so they had larger areas of distribution and bigger advertising budgets, especially after TV became a part of American life. And I don't think I'm making this up, but I believe in 1950, only about 9% of American households had TVs, but by the end of the decade, over 90% did. So, and this is huge for companies that can afford that advertising, which are the Anheuser-Busch's. I know that Anheuser-Busch did a survey to see if it really helped, and it did. And so they're like, yes, we'll stick to this. Well, at this time, Olympia was, in the 50s anyway, was still, just doing radio spots and doing very well. But this is really when advertising is starting to make a big difference because, right, as I said, this beer is pretty much all homogenous. It's all pretty light beer that is cheap that people like. So how are you going to sell it? You're going to market it differently. And so the smaller breweries are starting to fold under the pressure, but Olympia was able to stay really competitive around the West, particularly, and the Pacific. By this time, 50s, 60s, like Coors is the undisputed king of the Rockies, but we have the share of the West. And by the mid-1970s, Olympia is the biggest beer in the West, and in order to compete with these big companies like Miller and Anheuser-Busch and Pabst, they purchased some breweries that were failing. So they bought the Theodore Hams Brewing Company out of St. Paul, Minnesota in 1974 and Lone Star Beer out of San Antonio in 1977. And because of these mergers, Olympia technically became the 6th largest brewery in the nation. But to give you an idea of how huge these top breweries were, Olympia's full capacity for production was around 9 million barrels per year, and the most they ever made was just under 7 million, while Budweiser was producing over 36 million. So I believe that the year that they were 6th largest was probably 1976 or so, and they produced like 6.7 million barrels. Anheuser-Busch produced 36.6 million. But, still during this time is when Olympia is at its height, and the brewery is a major tourist attraction in the area, getting thousands of visitors a year, like Bob Hope, as you can see, Jerry Lewis, Count Basie, other entertainers throughout the decade. I've had some people describe it as like Disneyland, right? Because there's just tourist buses of international tour groups coming. There's hundreds of thousands of visitors coming, especially in 1962 for the Seattle World's Fair. The company or the brewery had like 500,000 visitors. So, I mean, it was really the lifeblood of Tumwater. And you can see here the wood paneling is from those tanks. In the tasting room, they came from those teak tanks that had been used in the early 1960s. And I would love to talk more about Olympia in popular culture. Like I said earlier, we could talk about it in movies or in music or, even just about it in all of Clint Eastwood movies. But I don't have time, unfortunately, and we don't have that kind of stuff in the archives at the Schmidt House. We have, the still of Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and these just fabulous distributor vans in Montana. But the internet does have a lot of references to Olympia in movies and music. But I am going to share with you, hopefully it's not going to deafen you with how loud it is, but I'm going to play you a commercial that we had digitized. Well, it's before I started working there, but I put this on YouTube in 2017, I think. And it's my favorite commercial. It's from 1973. It's called General. Oh, no. You can go. Can you go back? Thank you. It's called General. Some people know it as the Ole Ole O song. But I would suggest take a look, try to find some Easter eggs. There's some stuff in here that you might still find around town.
Ole, ole, oh. Ole, ole, oh. Ole, ole, oh. Ole, ole, oh. It's the water, oh, that makes it ole beer. It's the water and the lot more.
It's the special care that makes Olympia such a special beer. That's Olympia. It's the way we age our Ole Ole beer. It's the water and the lot. It's the hops and grain, the best that we can buy.
It's the extra time. That's just one reason why.
The time to make it great,
To make Olympia,
it's the water and the lot. Ole Ole Ole.
The last time I played that, it made people cry, and I don't. And that's what I'm here for. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And while during the 1970s, it seemed like Olympia was unstoppable, what the public didn't know was that sales were actually stagnant for most of the decade because of all that consolidation that I mentioned. They never lost money, but the two plants that they bought were failing, and they cost a lot to try to operate. Well, after they bought Hams, I know that they went in and they assessed, and they were like, oh, this needs a lot of work. This needs a lot of work, and it took a lot to update it, keep it clean, and they needed repairs. It's really snowy in Minnesota. It was like, this is a nightmare. And eventually Pabst swooped in, and essentially it made Olympia the last regional beer. So at this time, the number of breweries in the U.S. was at an all-time low. There were less than 50 brewers and less than 100 facilities making beer. Right now, we're at an all-time high. I haven't checked, but the last time I checked, like a year ago, and there's over 8,000 breweries in the country right now. And the segments of how breweries are categorized are different now. But when you think about it, there's really small local microbreweries, or there are huge ones. And sometimes there are small ones like a Red Hook that is partly owned by a Budweiser, so it can actually be distributed anywhere. So, there's lots of breweries that are small that you can, from California that you can get up here, or made here, but you could get in California. But there's really nothing there's no mid-sized brewery that's shipping all of its own beer and making all of its own beer. So in that way, Olympia was really the last of its kind. And by this time, Rainier had already gone under. Hams obviously had already gone under. Forgetting other ones, but there's a Leinenkugel still exists, but again, it is also partly owned by one of these mega brewers now, just run by that family. So like I said, Olympia is really sort of the last of its kind. This headline is from 1982, but the merger wasn't finalized until 1983. And then, as most of you, if not all of you know, operations continued at the plant until 2003 when the last whistle blew. And I would say, and the brewery is looking a lot worse for wear, but I do want to point out that this picture on the left, the old brew house does not look like this anymore. This picture I took in fall of 2017, but since then, the city has completely renovated all the brickwork. They had special bricks made from Chehalis, which is where these bricks came from. So they're a weird color of red, and they are a weird size, and they are very expensive. But the facade of the building looks a lot better, and the windows and the roofs are covered up so the weather is not getting in. I believe that they are now working on the foundation and making it seismically sound, but this work is going to be ongoing for a long time. And I don't want to end on a note of the brewery is looking pretty bad, because, whatever ends up happening, I imagine that one of the questions I'll get is, what's going on with the brewery? So I'll just nip that in the bud right now. Not a lot, and I don't know. I know pretty much what the public does, which is there's always lots of rumors, and it's going to cost a ton of money to do literally anything, so nothing ever happens. And I don't know how much that really matters to us. Whatever ends up happening with the physical buildings, we obviously have this super rich history that everybody still really appreciates. And for a lot of people who remember its heyday, it is very sad to see what it's turned into, but it's also like a point of pride because this is who we are and this is what our community is based around. So I would like to end on that note because I don't think the brewery history or its importance is going anywhere anytime soon, no matter what is going on with its physical properties. And with that, I will just leave you with this, one of my favorites, Leopold, because he's actually smiling. And happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was so great. So we have one comment from online that I'm going to read while Felicia gets up and people can start to think about what they want to ask. Gary says that his family worked for the Olympia Brewing Company approximately 225 years. The Lawtons. I worked there for 34 years with many memories and stories about the brewery. Thank you so much for keeping the history of the Olympia Brewery.
Oh, I am happy to do it. Also, that's not surprising to me at all. There's so many family names that I see on things, and I'm like, oh, that's a brewery family. That's a name.
Felicia's going to come around with, just raise your hand if you've got a question. And for those of you at home, you can just go ahead and put that in the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. Oh, come on, you guys.
Did anybody cry?
I got a little misty. You made me feel old, that commercial. I remember it.
Well, I got a chill when you mentioned the last whistle, and I have a story about that, but I was wondering, does anybody still have the whistle?
Yeah, the city of Tumwater has the whistle. It is at the Valley. It's at the golf course. And whenever they have events, when they have 4th of July, when they have golf tournaments, Brewfest, everything, they start it with the whistle.
That's great.
Yeah, that would make me cry. But yeah.
I grew up on the west side of Olympia in the 70s, and on a summer day, even on the west side of Olympia, you could hear that whistle blow, like at every shift change and at the noon hour. It's just an amazing thing. And then early 2000s, I made a film about Olympia, and I must have been in there 2002, and I filmed the guy pulling the whistle, and then I got to go up to the roof and film a close-up of the whistle blowing, and I think I must have set their camera rolling and then went away or would have blown my eardrums. But I just remember that. And also the other funny thing I remember is that there's that steep hill when you drive across the bridge of the brewery. There's a really steep hill, and I think it's just ivy covered now, but it used to be a golf course green lawn. And I remember driving by that as a kid, riding through there, and the guy would be mowing it, letting down a lawnmower on a rope and pulling it back up. No kidding.
Oh, yeah. Everybody loves to talk about that. I had somebody recently ask if he could take some of that ivy because he used to know the gardener, and he was just like, I want some of that ivy because I think the gardener maybe planted it. I think that was Doc Snyder. He wasn't in that commercial, but he has his own commercial. It's on YouTube. You can look it up.
So we have a couple of questions online. Mo asks, after saying that was fantastic,
Thank you.
do you know if there was ever rivalry between the Oli beer founders and Henry's? I'm assuming they mean Henry Weinhardt's?
Yeah, Henry Weinhardt died before Leopold. His son-in-law took over. But no, Leopold didn't have rivalries with anybody, nor did Peter and co. They were all in an industry together. You would think, if anything, that they would maybe have a rivalry with Rainier, But no, we have lots of letters with fantastic letterhead, from the Bush boys, from, I can't remember their names because Weinhard wasn't their last name, but whoever took over Weinhard's after him. And Emil Sick, the company or the brothers who owned Rainier before Prohibition, because Rainier just has a crazy complicated history. But no, there didn't seem to be, and certainly no animosity. If there was rivalry, it would have been friendly, but there's nothing I've ever seen in records that would indicate that there was any sort of real rivalry. They're just business dudes doing business, making beer, trying to make people happy.
All right, we have another question online. Mitchell asks, did most of the brewery workers live in the immediate area and walk to work each day?
Whether they walked, I don't know, but the first part is yes. And I don't know when this became a policy, but I know from people I've spoken to, at least who worked there in the 70s, 80s, they wanted you to be local. They wanted you to be in the community. So I know of some people who moved from Tacoma, say, or, they wanted you to be in Olympia or Tumwater to be nearby. But I've certainly heard a lot of stories, especially before Prohibition, of people walking to work, because and before Prohibition, I mean, even like turn of the century, because before the iconic bridge that's over the Lower Falls right now, there was a sort of another bridge that it's not as cool looking. But people would walk across it because, Tumwater didn't look anything like it does today, but especially before the freeway. So people could walk from houses in Tumwater across this bridge and walk to the brewery over the water.
The person who asked the question about the rivalry commented back, beer dudes usually get along with other beer dudes.
Yeah, that's what I've learned.
You had mentioned, you kind of brought up the World War II and that you had sent, they had sent some beer over to the troops overseas. Just in general, I know with, Americans were fairly or had a lot of antipathy towards German in general, and for them to be German immigrants, do you know if the brewery suffered any of those kind of prejudices?
That's such a good question. They didn't. So Leopold died in 1914, and that's the same year as World War I started. And I've never seen anything that there actually was any animosity or backlash against them for being German. Leopold actually disavowed. He said, he was a naturalized U.S. citizen, but he had said, as the Kaiser was getting all antsy to do war, he was like, I am no longer a German. He did not align with what the Kaiser was doing. And then as far as World War II goes, again, no, I've never heard anything. What I find fascinating about Peter is I've found that and this is absolutely not publicized, but he sent money to one organization that was for Jewish Americans, and he sent money to an organization that was for Japanese Americans. He also attended a lecture by a pacifist, like this British woman who was a pacifist that he went to with his wife and in-laws. That was before the U.S. had entered World War II. But he seemed to be very open-minded about different politics and different people. I've never heard an ill word about Peter. Again, it's kind of like Leopold, just nobody has anything mean to say about these people. So it almost sounds like I'm not objective, but I've just literally never heard anything bad about them. And it seems like Peter was very, very nice and very open to everybody and empathetic and welcoming to everybody. And I don't know how much that played into advertising, but I do know that before a lot of other breweries, they had advertisements in Spanish and in Chinook jargon in the 1950s.
This will be our last question.
Oh, gee, nice.
No pressure, Don. Better be a good one.
Come on, Don.
You mentioned you didn't want to talk about Prohibition, but the Schmidts were extremely community-minded. I mean, they were supporting every kinds of community effort. They helped provide the firefighters for the Tumwater Fire Department and that kind of thing. But you didn't.
The hotels or the bus line? What are we getting at here?
Do I have a story or something? Anyway, I'm just very impressed by how the The Schmidt family is still represented by the Olympia Tumwater Foundation that they started. And in fact, the Falls Park, which is now Brewery Park at Tumwater Falls, was built in time for the Seattle World's Fair. And that was to help draw the visitors off going to Seattle to the 1962 World's Fair. They just were very loved by everybody. But Tumwater was 50 years old by the time Leopold got here in 1895 and 6. And so we're the oldest American community in the state of Washington. And north of, well, it wasn't a state then, of course, but north of the Columbia. So can you talk about some of the activities? For example, the hotels. Can you talk a little bit about how they got involved in hotels during Prohibition?
One quick Prohibition story.
Okay.
Yes, Peter owned hotels. Him and his brother Adolf owned hotels, and they and I think it was about 4 other business owners decided to, or hotel owners in the state of Washington, formed a small consortium of hotel owners. They eventually did sell it. You know, I think he was based out of Seattle. He had an office in Seattle. And when brewing came back, he decided to sell it. He was no longer in the hotel business. That hotel business has sold a few times. It is now Westin International. He also is credited with like starting one of the first bus lines between Portland and Seattle, even though it was not Greyhound, but it was a bus line between Portland and Seattle. So, like I said, there could be a book about what he did during Prohibition, and probably just on him generally, because he's very interesting.
Thank you, Megan. That was so great.
Thank you.